$107.75 billion. That is Vietnam's electronics exports in 2025, up 48.4% from the year before, and the United States took $42 billion of that, an 81% increase year on year. If you want to understand the most consequential supply chain story in Asia right now, you need to understand why those numbers happened and why the story underneath is harder than the headline.
Those are genuinely staggering numbers. Set the scene for us.
The setup is a bet Vietnam has been making for roughly a decade. If you can position yourself between China and the United States, geographically, diplomatically, commercially, you capture the supply chain diversification wave that US-China tension is forcing. And in 2025, that bet had its biggest payoff yet.
The tariff deal.
October 2025, the US and Vietnam agreed to reduce the tariff on Vietnamese goods from 46% to 20%. That is a substantial reduction, and it came after months of negotiation under serious pressure. The previous tariff posture on Chinese goods had been creating a massive transshipment problem. Chinese goods rerouted through Vietnam with minimal processing to dodge US tariffs.
So Vietnam had to prove it was not just a pass-through.
Exactly. The 20% rate came with conditions. Goods with significant Chinese content face an additional 40% transshipment tariff. The message from Washington was clear. We are not giving you preferential access to the US market so you can be China's export loophole. You need to demonstrate genuine value add.
How is Vietnam doing on that standard?
Mixed. The electronics export number is real. Samsung alone has over $17 billion in cumulative investment in Vietnam. It manufactures roughly half of its global smartphone output there. Apple has committed around $16 billion in its Vietnamese supplier network. Intel has $40 billion in its Ho Chi Minh City chip testing facility, which is one of Intel's largest single operations globally. These are not shell operations. There are genuine assembly and testing facilities with significant employment and meaningful technology transfer. But the question of how deep the value chain actually goes is more complicated, and we will get to that.
Walk me through the new investment wave, because it feels like something shifted beyond just traditional electronics assembly.
Something did shift. In 2025, Vietnam attracted investment across three distinct categories. First, the traditional electronics assembly players expanding capacity. Samsung, LG, Foxconn, and the Apple supplier network adding lines to meet demand that the tariff environment created. Second, and this is newer, hyperscalers and AI infrastructure investors. Microsoft has proposed a $2 billion hyperscale data center, and total AI-related investment commitments in Vietnam have exceeded $7 billion across all players. Third, and most significant for the long-run story, NVIDIA opened its first research and development center in Vietnam in December 2024.
The NVIDIA Center is interesting. What does that actually mean?
It is somewhere between strategic flag planting and genuine capability building. NVIDIA's Jensen Huang has been personally engaged with Vietnam's leadership, including meetings with General Secretary To Lam. The center was announced with significant fanfare. But the deeper story is what Vietnamese companies are doing with this relationship. FPT, Vietnam's largest IT services company, announced a $200 million AI factory in January 2025, running on NVIDIA H100 chips. That facility went live and is positioning itself as a regional AI compute hub for Southeast Asian enterprise clients.
So FPT is trying to become an AI infrastructure provider, not just a software outsourcer.
That is exactly the bet. And FPT has a second piece of this, a partnership with Viettel, the state-owned telecom, to develop a domestic semiconductor value chain. Viettel has committed $380 million to a new research and development center. Vietnam's two largest technology organizations are for the first time making serious bets on domestic hardware and AI capability, rather than purely serving as the manufacturing and services arm of foreign technology companies.
And then there's the AI law.
Vietnam passed Law 134/2025/QH15, which took effect on March 1st of this year, just 3 weeks ago. It is the first dedicated AI legislation in Southeast Asia. Existing AI services have until March 2027 to comply. The law covers data governance, algorithmic accountability, and specific requirements around high-risk AI applications, including public services and finance.
How is the business community reading that?
Cautiously optimistic on the regulatory clarity, but watchful on implementation. A clear AI governance framework reduces uncertainty for enterprise customers and makes Vietnam a more credible partner for AI deployment. But the compliance burden on smaller Vietnamese companies is a real concern. We will get into the structural risks in the next segment.
Let's take that deeper look.
We talked about the headline numbers. Let me push on the structure here, because I think the China+1 story has a hidden complexity that the 48% export growth number obscures.
This is the right place to go. The conventional narrative is U.S.-China tension drives global companies to diversify manufacturing out of China. Vietnam wins. And Vietnam has won. The numbers are real. But winning the first round of supply chain diversification and winning the long game of industrial capability building are different challenges.
What are the structural constraints?
Three main ones. First, physical capacity. Vietnam's industrial parks are running at 85 to 95% occupancy. When the biggest economic zones in the north, Hanoi, Bac Ninh, Bac Giang, are nearly full and companies are still making commitments, you get a land and infrastructure bottleneck that slows expansion regardless of investment appetite. Getting approvals, getting power connections, getting water, the infrastructure to support a new factory in Vietnam takes longer than the equivalent in China or even Thailand.
And that creates a natural ceiling on how fast the growth can continue.
At the pace it ran in 2025, yes. The 48% export growth reflects in part the catch-up from investments made in 2022 and 2023 coming online. You would not expect that rate to be sustainable even in a perfect policy environment.
What is the second structural constraint?
Component dependency. The deep irony of Vietnam's China+1 success is that a significant portion of the components going into Vietnamese electronics exports comes from China. Samsung's Vietnamese factories source substantial inputs from Chinese suppliers. The Apple ecosystem in Vietnam has a similar pattern. This is not unusual in global manufacturing, but it means that the value capture in Vietnam is concentrated in the labor-intensive assembly stage, not in the higher-margin component design and manufacturing stages.
Which is exactly what the U.S. transshipment tariff is trying to address.
Right. The 40% additional tariff on transshipped goods is essentially forcing Vietnam to demonstrate that it is adding genuine value, that Vietnamese workers and Vietnamese facilities are doing substantive work, not just relabeling. And to their credit, the Vietnamese government has been aggressive about cracking down on fraudulent certificates of origin. But the underlying component dependency is a structural feature that takes years to change, not something tariff pressure alone resolves.
Third constraint?
The skills question. Vietnam has a highly educated workforce. Literacy rate is high, engineering universities are producing graduates, and the FPT software model of training and deploying tech talent has been a genuine success story for 2 decades. But the move from labor-intensive assembly to higher-value design and engineering requires a different kind of talent. The semiconductor engineers, the AI researchers, the firmware developers. There is a significant gap between where Vietnam's talent pipeline is today and what a genuine domestic semiconductor industry would require.
This is where the FPT and Viettel story matters most.
It is. FPT Software currently has around 60,000 employees, a significant portion of whom are software engineers. But software engineering for IT outsourcing and semiconductor chip design are quite different disciplines. The AI factory that FPT launched in January 2025 is interesting precisely because it represents a bet that Vietnam can move up the value chain in AI services, using the H100 infrastructure to offer AI model training and inference to regional clients, rather than purely being on the receiving end of foreign AI deployment.
Let's talk about ripple effects, because what happens in Vietnam does not stay in Vietnam. It affects the whole Southeast Asia manufacturing and tech ecosystem.
The most direct ripple is on the countries that were competing with Vietnam for the same FDI. Cambodia, Bangladesh, and to some extent Thailand and Indonesia were all seen as potential China+1 beneficiaries. Vietnam's success, particularly in electronics, has effectively set a benchmark that these countries now have to meet or differentiate against. Bangladesh is competitive on textiles but has not made the move into electronics. Cambodia is struggling with its own governance and infrastructure challenges. Thailand is trying to move into semiconductors and data centers but is competing from a higher cost base.
What about the relationship with China itself? Because Vietnam still needs China for components, for tourism, for trade.
Vietnam's relationship with China is the most diplomatically sophisticated balancing act in Southeast Asia. Vietnam fought a border war with China in 1979, has ongoing territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and yet China is Vietnam's largest import partner and a critical part of the manufacturing supply chain. The Vietnamese government has consistently refused to be instrumentalized in the U.S.-China competition. No U.S. military bases, continued trade with China, while also positioning itself to capture the commercial benefits of U.S.-China decoupling and manufacturing.
You can play both sides.
Up to a point. The transshipment tariff is essentially the U.S. telling Vietnam, we see what you are doing, and there are limits. How Vietnam manages that constraint over the next 3 to 4 years will determine whether it can continue to grow as a manufacturing hub or whether it hits a ceiling imposed by U.S. trade policy enforcement.
And the VinFast situation is an interesting case study in this tension.
VinFast is the most ambitious attempt to build a Vietnamese-owned global technology brand. Electric vehicles, full vertical integration, listed on NASDAQ, and yet VinFast relies on Chinese battery technology. Which is fine. Every non-Chinese EV company is grappling with how to manage the Chinese battery supply chain. But it illustrates that even the most ambitious domestic champion in Vietnam has not escaped the component dependency issue. The country that is benefiting from China+1 manufacturing diversification is itself still deeply dependent on Chinese components for its flagship industrial project. That is not a contradiction. It is just the reality of where global supply chains are in 2026.
Let's go deeper on the bear case in the next segment. Contrarian corner. Because the consensus on Vietnam is genuinely bullish. China+1 winner, foreign direct investment pouring in, first AI law in Southeast Asia, NVIDIA opening R&D centers, electronics exports up nearly 50%. What is the case against?
The bear case starts with a question I think is under-asked. Is Vietnam actually building an industrial economy, or is it renting one?
Explain what you mean.
The factories are real. The jobs are real. The exports are real. But who owns the factories? Samsung, Apple, Foxconn, LG, Bosch. The primary beneficiaries of Vietnam's electronics export boom are overwhelmingly foreign-owned companies. Vietnam captures the wages and the corporate tax revenues and some supplier development, but the profits largely flow out. That is a better situation than not having the factories at all, and it is how every successful East Asian economy started. Taiwan in the 1970s, Korea in the 1960s, China in the 1980s. But the transition from contract manufacturer to technology owner took those countries 20 to 30 years, serious government investment in education and R&D, and in some cases deliberate technology transfer requirements that modern free trade frameworks make harder to impose.
So the question is not whether Vietnam is growing, but whether the growth compounds into something domestically owned and controlled.
Exactly. And the VinFast case is instructive here as a kind of paradox. VinFast is the most ambitious attempt to build a Vietnamese-owned global technology brand, and yet VinFast relies on Chinese battery technology, has struggled to achieve profitability at scale, and its NASDAQ listing has not translated into the kind of sustained capital market confidence that would fund the next stage of growth. Which is fine. EV is a brutally competitive market globally, but it illustrates that even the most well-resourced domestic champion in Vietnam is navigating the same structural challenges as the broader economy.
What about the AI law? Is being the first Southeast Asian country with dedicated AI legislation a competitive advantage, or is it regulatory overhead?
That is the sharper version of the question, and there are genuinely two ways to read it. The optimistic reading is that Vietnam is building regulatory infrastructure ahead of the curve. A clear AI governance framework reduces uncertainty for enterprise customers and makes Vietnam a more credible partner for large-scale AI deployment relative to markets with no regulatory clarity. Singapore used its proactive regulatory posture as a competitive asset in financial services for decades. Vietnam could try to do the same in AI.
And the pessimistic reading?
Is that Law 134 was drafted under significant time pressure, with limited technical expertise in the process, and that compliance requirements will fall disproportionately on smaller Vietnamese companies that do not have the legal and technical resources that Samsung or Microsoft has to navigate new frameworks. If the law effectively raises the bar for domestic AI startups, while large foreign incumbents can absorb the compliance cost, you end up with a regulation that nominally promotes AI governance, but structurally advantages the very foreign players Vietnam is trying to build domestic alternatives to.
What about the data center question? You mentioned Microsoft's $2 billion proposal. Is Vietnam going to be a genuine AI compute hub, or is it going to be outcompeted by Singapore and Malaysia?
Singapore is still the regional anchor for high-margin, latency-sensitive AI workloads. Malaysia, specifically the Johor corridor, is absorbing a lot of the overload capacity that Singapore's land constraints cannot accommodate, and Malaysia has significant cost and energy advantages. Vietnam's positioning is as a lower-cost alternative for workloads that require domestic data residency but do not need Singapore's financial services regulatory environment. Vietnam's data localization requirements, similar to Indonesia's, structurally guarantee some demand for domestic compute capacity. The risk is the same one we discussed for Indonesia in our last episode. You build impressive-looking infrastructure that serves compliance requirements but does not capture the high-value AI training and inference workloads that will define which economies have structural advantages in the AI era.
The skills gap shows up here too.
It does. Vietnam's computer science graduates are talented. FPT University alone produces around 15,000 technology graduates per year, but AI infrastructure operations at hyperscale require a very different skill set from software development. GPU cluster management, MLOps pipelines, security architecture for high-compliance enterprise workloads, these are specialized capabilities that take years of on-the-job experience to develop. NVIDIA's R&D center in Hanoi could be a talent development mechanism for this, but it is early days, and the staffing numbers have not been publicly disclosed.
Let me push on the transshipment risk one more time, because there is a scenario where the U.S. decides Vietnam is not meeting the genuine value add standard and reimposes tariffs at a higher level.
That is a real scenario. The 20% rate is not locked in permanently. It is the outcome of a negotiation that can be renegotiated. If U.S. trade enforcement finds evidence of systematic transshipment, Chinese goods with minimal value added in Vietnam being exported to the U.S. as Vietnamese origin, the political pressure to respond would be significant. Vietnam's government understands this risk, which is why it has been proactive on certificates of origin enforcement. But the structural component dependency means the risk does not disappear just because the enforcement improves.
So the bear case is Vietnam hits its industrial park capacity ceiling, component dependency limits value capture, the AI law creates compliance friction for domestic players, and U.S. trade policy turns less favorable. Not a collapse scenario, but a slowdown.
That is the most likely version of the bear case, not catastrophe. Vietnam will remain an important manufacturing and technology hub regardless. The question is whether it achieves the structural upgrade from assembly economy to design economy, or remains in the assembly tier. That distinction has enormous long-run consequences for Vietnamese wages, for the competitiveness of Vietnamese companies internationally, and for whether the FPT and Viettel bets on domestic technology capability actually pay off.
Let's get to the action items.
Action items. What should investors and operators watching Vietnam actually track?
3 action items. First, watch the transshipment enforcement data and the domestic content ratios on Vietnamese electronics exports over the next 6 to 12 months. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has intensified its auditing of Vietnamese goods origin claims. If there is a significant enforcement action, a major company penalized, or a tariff reclassification, it would be the clearest signal that Vietnam's electronics export boom has a compliance ceiling. The specific metric to track is the ratio of Vietnamese domestic component content in the top export categories. If that number is rising, Vietnam is genuinely building the value chain. If it is flat while exports grow, the transshipment risk is compounding.
The second action item.
Track FPT's AI factory revenue and client acquisition over 2026. FPT Software has been positioning the $200 million H100 infrastructure as a regional AI services hub, training models, running inference, offering cloud GPU capacity to Southeast Asian enterprise clients. Whether they can actually sign meaningful contracts with clients outside Vietnam, regional banks, healthcare systems, manufacturing companies deploying AI, is the best leading indicator of whether Vietnam can move up the AI value chain or whether the compute infrastructure remains primarily serving the domestic market. FPT is publicly listed, so the quarterly revenue disclosures on AI services will be trackable. Look specifically at the proportion of AI services revenue coming from non-Vietnamese clients.
Third,
watch the first 12 months of implementation of Law 134, Vietnam's AI law, and specifically how the Ministry of Science and Technology handles the exemption and compliance process for existing services that have until March 2027 to adapt. Regulation implementation quality is almost always more important than the text of the law itself. If the ministry is issuing clear guidance, engaging with industry on technical standards, and processing compliance applications at a reasonable pace, it signals Vietnam has built the regulatory capacity to govern AI at scale. If the process is opaque, bureaucratic, and inconsistent, the law was a political statement rather than an operational framework.
So the 3 signals are domestic content enforcement as a trade policy test, FPT AI services revenue as a value chain upgrade indicator, and Law 134 implementation quality as a regulatory capacity signal. Those are all watching the same underlying question. Is Vietnam building genuine domestic industrial and technology capability, or is it renting out its geography and labor force to foreign capital that could leave if conditions change?
That is exactly the frame, and I want to be transparent that Vietnam is one of the stories where I find myself genuinely uncertain. The bull case, Vietnam successfully leveraging the China+1 moment to fund the transition to a higher value economy, is historically achievable. Korea and Taiwan did something like it. The bear case, Vietnam captures the assembly tier, builds impressive-looking tech infrastructure, but fails to make the institutional and educational investments that would allow it to own the higher value stages, is equally well documented in other markets. It depends on decisions that have not been made yet, how aggressively Vietnam invests in domestic R&D, whether state-owned sector reform happens at the pace the private sector requires, whether the political incentives align for the kind of education reform that genuine technology capability building demands.
The AI law is a signal on the institutional question.
It is. And so is the government's active engagement with NVIDIA and the FPT AI factory. These are not random. They reflect a deliberate strategy to position Vietnam as an AI destination, not just a manufacturing destination. Whether that strategy has the fiscal backing and the institutional execution capacity to succeed is what 2026 and 2027 will tell us. The electronics export numbers will tell us how well Vietnam is managing the assembly tier. The FPT and Vietnam announcements will tell us whether there is genuine domestic ambition at the technology layer. And the implementation of Law 134 will tell us whether the government can build the regulatory architecture that enterprise AI deployment requires.
And if you want the written version with all the data and sources from today's episode, we publish a free daily newsletter at asiatechmacro.substack.com. Everything we referenced today is linked there.
In our next episode, we are turning to Taiwan, specifically the question of whether TSMC's Arizona and Japan fabs are genuinely reducing Taiwan's strategic concentration risk, or whether the geopolitical logic of concentrating advanced semiconductor production on a contested island is as fragile as the skeptics say it is. It is a story about the tension between economic efficiency and strategic resilience that does not have an easy answer.
Stay tuned for that.
Stay data-driven. Bye.